In 1925, 13 years after the abdication of China's last emperor and the formal collapse of the imperial system that had governed the country for millennia, China remained mired in profound and seemingly intractable turmoil, torn apart by warring factions with approximately 1.5 million men under arms scattered across its vast and fractured territory, and the death of revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen had left millions in deep mourning across the nation, depriving a restless and suffering people of a figure who had seemed to many to offer the genuine possibility of a brighter and more unified future. Yet Sun's central ambition, to defeat the warlords who had fractured the country and to bring China under Kuomintang rule, lived on in his 37-year-old successor, Chiang Kai-shek, a charismatic, highly effective, and deeply ambitious military commander who had received his military education in Japan, where he first encountered Sun Yat-sen and joined the revolutionary cause in 1908, subsequently rising to lead the Kuomintang's Whampoa Military Academy and earning a reputation as a decisive and forceful leader. At the time of Sun's death, much of China was dominated by warlords, an assortment of ambitious generals and regional strongmen, commanding their own private armies, whose loyalties extended no further than their own interests and territorial ambitions, while the Kuomintang, also referred to as the Nationalists, controlled only the southern provinces of Guangxi and Guangdong and their capital, Canton. To strengthen its position against these entrenched adversaries, the Kuomintang had entered into an uneasy and deeply suspicious alliance with the Chinese Communist Party, a coalition known as the First United Front, which secured vital military and financial support from the Soviet Union, though many within the Kuomintang, Qing foremost among them, harbored serious and persistent doubts about Soviet intentions. Cheng's own visit to Russia had convinced him that communism was fundamentally incompatible with China's needs and traditions, and his distrust of his Soviet advisors and communist allies never fully abated. Amid a widespread and genuine popular hunger for change across Chinese society, driven by deep resentment of warlord chaos, endemic corruption, and the interference of foreign powers in Chinese affairs, -1925, saw a significant and energetic rise in labor movements and anti-imperialist agitation, and when the multinational Shanghai police opened fire on protesters demonstrating in the streets, the resulting outrage triggered large-scale strikes across southern cities, substantially swelling the ranks of both the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, with passionate new recruits. Yet the fundamental suspicion between these two structurally incompatible allies continued to fester beneath the surface of their cooperation, and in 1926 Cheng moved with characteristic decisiveness to neutralize what he perceived as a growing internal threat, alleging an imminent communist plot against the nationalist movement and launching a preemptive coup in which he declared martial law in Canton, arrested or expelled political rivals and Soviet advisors, and purged communists from the Whampoa Military Academy, among them the rising party figure and gifted political organizer, Zhou Enlai, who was expelled from his role as political commissar at the academy. These bold and ruthless actions solidified Cheng's grip on both the Kuomintang military apparatus and the broader Nationalist Party, and despite the upheaval, the Soviets, too anxious to surrender whatever remaining influence they held in China, agreed to continue their military support, leaving the First United Front intact if severely strained. With his internal authority thus consolidated, Cheng now set out to fulfill Sun Yat-sen's defining aspiration: a northern expedition to defeat China's warlords one by one and bring the country under unified Kuomintang rule. The most formidable adversaries standing in his path were the warlord Zhang Zuolin, who controlled the internationally recognized Beiyang government in Peking and dominated the north, Wu Peifu, known as the Jade Marshal, who held sway over central China, and Sun Xuanfang, who governed several eastern provinces including the strategically vital cities of Nanking and Shanghai. Cheng's forces, the National Revolutionary Army, numbered around 100,000 men, considerably fewer than their combined opponents, but were better trained, equipped with modern Soviet weaponry, and supplemented by warlord allies including Li Zongren, Feng Yuxiang, and Yan Shishan, each of whom commanded substantial forces of their own and who had thrown their lot in with the nationalist cause, judging that alliance with Cheng offered the best prospects for their own survival and continued regional influence. Cheng's plan was a methodical and carefully sequenced northward advance, prioritizing the defeat of individual warlords before moving against the next, and in the first months of the northern expedition, The campaign made rapid and impressive progress across the map. Within months, Kuomintang forces had taken control of southern China's most strategically important cities, including Wuhan, Shanghai, and Nanking, successively driving Wu Peifu and then Sun Xuanfang from their strongholds, and attracting a flood of defectors from warlord armies that swelled the National Revolutionary Army to a massive force of roughly 700,000 men, leaving only Jiang Zuolin still holding out in the north. With victory and national unification appearing genuinely within reach for the first time, however, the deep tensions between the Kuomintang and communist factions within the National Revolutionary Army erupted once again, and Chiang's worst suspicions seemed to be confirmed as nationalist troops approached Shanghai. Just days before their expected arrival, Zhou Enlai and communist organizers mobilized a workers' uprising that seized effective control of the great port city. Chiang, however, had his own powerful and well-connected allies in Shanghai in the form of Du Yusheng, known as Big Ear Du, a triad leader and the undisputed kingpin of the Shanghai underworld, who was a close personal ally of the nationalist commander. In the early hours of the 12th of April 1927, Du ordered his Green Gang to launch coordinated attacks on the communists and trade unionists who had taken over the city, and when thousands of Shanghai workers poured into the streets in protest at the violence, Kuomintang troops opened fire on the crowds without hesitation. Over the following days and weeks, an estimated 12,000 communists were killed or disappeared in Shanghai alone, marking the bloody and definitive end of the First United Front in what became known as the Shanghai Massacre, an event that signaled the opening of a broader and systematic campaign in which the Kuomintang hunted down communists across all territory under their control, carrying out mass executions and disappearances on a vast scale. The communists responded with a series of armed uprisings intended to demonstrate that their movement could not be extinguished. Zhou Enlai, who narrowly escaped Shanghai with his life, led an armed insurrection against Kuomintang rule in Nanchang. The following month, Mao Zedong organized the Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. And in December, a third uprising erupted in Canton. All three were swiftly and brutally crushed by Kuomintang forces. Yet there was no mistaking the historical significance of what had happened. A brutal and potentially transformative new front had opened in China's already extraordinarily complex and violent revolutionary struggles, one that would shape the trajectory of the country's political destiny for decades to come, and that placed the question of who would ultimately govern China, the nationalists or the communists, at the very center of the nation's future. With the communist uprisings suppressed for the time being, Chiang's northern expedition resumed its advance, and on the 6th of June 1928, Kuomintang troops entered Peking, the old imperial capital, in a moment laden with historical and symbolic weight, forcing Jiang Zuolin to retreat northward across the Great Wall into Manchuria, a region already under heavy Japanese political and economic influence and home to a substantial Japanese military presence in the form of the Kwantung Army. The Japanese, who had for years provided Jiang with support, but now judged him to have outlived his usefulness as a compliant partner, arranged for his assassination as he traveled north by train, a massive bomb planted by a Japanese officer obliterating his carriage. They anticipated more favorable results from Jiang's 27-year-old son, Jiang Zuoliang, who became known as the Young Marshal, but the younger Jiang proved to have his own firmly held convictions, opening negotiations with the Kuomintang and, in exchange for pledging allegiance to Chiang while retaining control of his father's northeastern power base, completing at last the nominal unification of China under a single flag, a single capital, and a single supreme leader. That fragile unity was almost immediately challenged, however, when in 1929 Chiang proposed a sweeping reorganization of the National Revolutionary Army, intending to reduce its size from approximately 1.5 million men to 715,000, a plan his generals, many of them former warlord commanders, correctly and indignantly interpreted as a deliberate attempt to undermine their personal power and autonomy. A coalition of disaffected generals launched an armed opposition that plunged China back into civil conflict in the Central Plains War, a struggle involving around 1 million soldiers in which Chiang suffered a series of early and costly setbacks before eventually regaining the upper hand thanks in large measure to the critical support of Jiang Zuoliang, who chose to back Chiang at the decisive moment. Victorious but at staggering human and economic cost, Chiang established his one-party government in Nanking, a former capital of the Ming dynasty, inaugurating what came to be known as the Nanking Decade, a period of sustained Kuomintang governance across eastern China. Though the country's unity in this era was, in truth, paper-thin, only Nanking and its surrounding area were under direct Kuomintang control. Most of the country continued to be administered by warlords of varying and conditional loyalty, and the communists, though severely weakened, remained an active and determined force, establishing pockets of resistance throughout the Chinese countryside. In power, Chiang, referred to with increasing formality as the Generalissimo or Commander-in-Chief, grew progressively more authoritarian in his methods, launching the New Life movement as a vehicle for reviving Confucian values and ideas as a homegrown, ideological alternative to communism, an initiative in which his American-educated wife, Sung Mei Ling, from a prominent Chinese Christian family, played a prominent and energetic public role, though the movement's practical impact on Chinese society proved limited. Parts of China were nonetheless modernizing with genuine and visible speed in the early 1930s. New laws promoted gender equality and extended protections to women's rights in marriage and property ownership. Access to education broadened. Newspapers, magazines, and journals proliferated across urban centers. New cinemas and theaters opened their doors. And ambitious infrastructure projects supported the gradual industrialization of the Chinese economy, with substantial foreign investment flowing in, notably from Japan. And yet, for all this surface-level modernization and the genuine progress visible in China's major cities, 85% of China's population remained peasants whose material circumstances had barely improved since the Qing dynasty, desperately poor, structurally neglected and largely overlooked by the Kuomintang government in Nanking, their land subject to rising rents, soil exhaustion, and erosion. And they were increasingly receptive to the message being actively spread among them by communist organizers who spoke directly, compellingly, and with evident sincerity to their accumulated grievances. And in 1931, catastrophic flooding devastated vast swaths of central and eastern China in a disaster of almost unimaginable scale, an estimated 1 to 4 million people and displacing many millions more in one of the deadliest natural disasters in all of recorded human history. Against this backdrop of internal fragility and humanitarian catastrophe, Japan, emboldened by a powerful domestic climate of militarism and nationalism, and aware of China's structural vulnerabilities, manufactured a pretext for outright conquest. On the night of the 18th of September 1931, rogue officers from the Japanese Kwantung Army secretly detonated a bomb on a section of the Japanese-controlled South Manchurian Railway near the city of Mukden and blamed Chinese saboteurs. Within 3 months, brought most of northeastern China under Japanese control. Japan created its own puppet state in the region, naming it Manchukuo, and placed China's deposed Qing Emperor Pui, then 26 years old, on a throne that conferred the appearance of legitimacy, on what was in reality an act of naked imperial conquest. All of China was outraged, but Chiang Kai-shek refused to be drawn into a general war with Japan at this moment, insisting on his policy of internal pacification before external resistance, and ordering Zhang Zhuliang's forces to withdraw rather than fight, a decision that earned him widespread and bitter public criticism but reflected his calculation that the communist threat was more immediately dangerous to the survival of his government. His preoccupation with the communists was not without justification. Of the approximately 10,000 Communist Party members who had survived the purges of 1927, a determined core had regrouped in the Chinese countryside and established several regional governments, known as Chinese Soviets, in remote and rural areas across the country. The most significant of these was the Jiangxi Soviet, whose chairman was Mao Zedong, the son of a wealthy farmer and a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party, which governed a total population of more than 3 million people and maintained its own bank, currency, and tax system, functioning as a genuine if embattled state within a state. Chiang launched a series of encirclement campaigns designed to isolate and destroy this communist stronghold, but the first, second, third, and fourth campaigns all failed in the face of determined and tactically adept Red Army resistance, with the fighting on both sides characterized by extraordinary brutality, mass executions of suspected enemies, and enormous civilian suffering. Finally, in September 1934, Chiang assembled nearly 1 million soldiers to encircle, blockade, and methodically crushed the Jiangxi Soviet, and this time the weakened and overstretched communists could not hold their ground. Gradually losing territory until only around 100,000 soldiers and civilians remained in a small area around the city of Ruijin, The Communist leadership took the fateful and desperate decision to abandon the Jiangxi Soviet entirely and attempt to break through the Kuomintang encirclement. Many were killed trying to escape, but the survivors, led by Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, embarked on what became an extraordinary year-long march of approximately 6,000 miles across some of the most forbidding and inhospitable terrain in China, fighting off Kuomintang pursuers, enduring hunger and exhaustion, crossing treacherous rivers and mountain ranges, and suffering losses at every stage of the journey, with fewer than 1 in 10 of those who set out from Jiangxi completing the march to Yan'an in the north, where they joined communist comrades who had made their way there from other parts of the country. This astonishing feat of endurance and survival entered the founding mythology of the Chinese Communist Party as the Long March, and Mao's leadership throughout the ordeal secured his dominant position at the top of the party, decisively sidelining his Soviet-backed rivals and establishing that the party would henceforth follow his vision rather than Moscow's directives. With communist fortunes apparently at their lowest ebb, events took a dramatic and unexpected turn in December 1936 when Chiang traveled to Xi'an in northern China to visit Jiang Zuliang, whose troops were conducting the anti-communist operations in the north but who had become deeply and openly frustrated by Chiang's persistent refusal to confront the Japanese invaders who had driven his army from Manchuria and assassinated his father. Jiang took the audacious step of kidnapping Chiang, forcing him to negotiate face-to-face with communist representatives headed by Zhou Enlai. After 2 tense weeks of negotiations, Chiang yielded to the pressure, agreeing to end the internal civil conflict against the communists and to confront the Japanese threat, the essential terms of what became known as the Second United Front, before being released and returning to Nanking, where he promptly placed Jiang under house arrest as punishment for the kidnapping. Though on the central and consequential question of forming an anti-Japanese alliance with his communist enemies, he kept his word. The war that had long seemed inevitable and was perhaps always implicit in the unresolved tensions between Japanese imperial ambition and Chinese national sovereignty finally began on the night of the 7th of July, 1937, when a small detachment of Japanese soldiers demanded entry to the walled town of Wanping, situated close to Peking, claiming they needed to conduct a search for a missing soldier from their unit. The Chinese garrison stationed there refused. Tensions rapidly and dangerously escalated between the two sides. A shot rang out from the Chinese position. Both sides returned fire in kind, and one of the bloodiest, most devastating and most consequential conflicts of the entire 20th century had irrevocably begun.